Well, just a quick introduction. I'm Matt Hamilton. I'm the Senior Director of Sales Engineering for a company called Casepoint, company you've never heard about, and an industry you may never have heard about. I work specifically in legal technology around e-discovery, which is electronic discovery, in the course of legal matters, particularly like litigation. There's a whole process of sharing data, and that's really where our technology works. But I've been in the legal industry. I started my career as a paralegal, got into technology on the hardware and the networking side, and then kind of shifted over into sales, and then ultimately ended up where I am now. Also spent a little stint in the military and worked as a chaplain for an Army group here in Texas for about 5 years. So appreciate the other veterans on the call as well. So what I'm going to look through, and feel free in the chat if you want to, if you have experience or you work in the legal area. It could be an attorney, it could be in the legal department of a government, a corporation, even a law firm, a paralegal, any kind of role like that. This would certainly be pertinent to you. But even if you work just in an organization and period, it could be a nonprofit, it could be a church, it could be a Fortune 1000, a government agency. These are applicable aspects that you should be aware of. And also, there's a little bit of this that you just need to be aware of for your personal life, because you could be subject to an employment investigation at some point, or a litigation, hopefully never, that you're sued for, or part of a lawsuit within an organization where you're called in as a custodian of data. So with that, just a few things to kind of think about from technology, and really where my world sits is around data. Data is huge, as you can imagine. Matter of fact, I just read a stat yesterday that since it's 2009, every 2 days we create more data than there was in all of history leading up to 2009. So if you can kind of think about that, that's huge numbers. But obviously there wasn't quite the prolific ability to create data with, back in the days with stone tablets and, just scribing things on clay tablets. But now we can create data at astronomical rates. As a matter of fact, if you think about email is really the most prolific form of data today, because everybody uses email, both personally, at your work. You're bouncing back and forth with people, and multiple people get copied on all those. Well, chat data, we're on Teams today. Chat data is exponentially increasing past that. Obviously, the pandemic and the COVID time increased that considerably because people were working more remotely. But in the next 12 to 18 months, the data that we have in chat, like Teams or Slack or even WhatsApp or Google Chat, that's going to exceed the number of instances or messages that we see in email within just the next 12 to 18 months. So it'll be the number one communication form that we use. Now, individually, we create a lot of data. Now, I know you specifically is mentioned in this kind of middle section here, but on average, an individual creates 1.7 megabytes of data per second. That's a lot of data. Now, granted, that's a lot of stuff that's broken out from machines that are creating data, but just on average across individuals, it averages out to about 1.7 meg per second. Total 2.5 exabytes of data are created, exabytes of data is created daily, which when you start thinking about this, if you're not technical and understand the data sizes, there's megabytes, which most people are familiar with, gigabytes, which most are familiar with, then you get to terabytes, which is 1,000 gigabytes. Then you go from terabytes to petabytes, and then petabytes to exabytes, and exabytes to zettabytes. So it kind of gives you a scope of how big they are. And every time you're jumping up, it's another 1,000. So it's 1,000 gigs as a terabyte, 1,000 terabytes as a petabyte. Total world storage is going to be 181 zettabytes by 2025. So that's a tremendous amount of data that's out there. And kind of in that same vein of what Kenneth was talking about in the last section, is your data is also important because it never disappears. No matter what you think, no matter how many times you delete it off your computer, no matter how many times you reset and reformat your phone, or you really anything, if you go get one of the softwares that erases data from a USB drive or your hard drive, it really never disappears. There's always a remnant underneath there, and with the smart forensic people, they can actually recreate a lot of that data. As a matter of fact, there's over 2,700 data centers in the US. So all that data is being stored just in the US alone in 2,700 different locations at the big level, plus all the little devices we have at our homes, from little flash drives to USB drives to network systems at home to your laptops, your tablets, your phones, and everything in between. Plus the whole conversation that was here today about the agriculture industry. All those little Internet of Things have storage on them. So they're maintaining data. The cars that we just looked at are maintaining data. So it's a lot of data out there. And then we start to level into this, the artificial intelligence aspects, machine learning, data analytics and data science. All of that kind of builds in around this idea of data. There's a lot of it. That's what I could have put on this screen, but I wanted to show you some facts along the way. So there's a lot of data out there. But where are we really heading with all this? So we know there's a lot of data. What does it mean from a technology perspective? Well, from a corporate perspective or a government perspective, and even in law firms, there are thousands of different types of data. I mean, you can think off your head of just the data that you've probably interacted with today. Well, we've had some messages in the chat. We've seen some videos. We've seen slideshows. We've seen photos inside those slide decks, the text that's part of those, Word documents, Excel files, PDFs. And then you get into all the other stuff that you may never come across. Like there's file types for three-dimensional drawings. If you're a hobbyist and you use things like CNC machines or 3D printers, there's code that goes into those to make them run and do the things that they do. So there's a tremendous volume of different data types, and they need to be addressed. And those are being increased every day. There's a new chat message, there's a new video service, there's a new format. Everybody's trying to create, from a business perspective, the new hot aspect of getting people's attention to use their data in the format that it would be used. Like TikTok didn't exist really 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and now it's the most prolific location for videos. There is that, like I mentioned, local, mobile, and cloud data, plus the iCloud that was referenced in the last session, or if you use Google Drive for work or OneDrive or SharePoint, all that data is being stored. So cybersecurity is a paramount piece of this puzzle from a corporate perspective. We need to know, what do we have, where do we have it, and how do we keep it protected, particularly in my space, because we deal with a lot of sensitive data for a litigation or an internal investigation, or we have a lot of government clients, for example, in my organization, one in this public record, so I can openly share it, but the Securities and Exchange Commission uses us exclusively for this aspect of their legal work. It's a lot of sensitive data. Then you layer into that, the generative AI that's a buzz everywhere right now, from ChatGPT to machine learning to where's it going to take us? Are we going to be overrun by robots like Terminator? Or what's the application of that inside the workspace? So really we have a few things that we have to keep in mind from a corporate perspective. And when I say corporate, I just mean a business perspective, also for government and law firms, but is managing your data, managing the threats against that data, the responses that you do for those threats, as well as when you have data requests, and then the cost associated with managing all that. Every time you're storing data somewhere, it costs something. Every time somebody has to create a file, that costs something. And then that really has an application in a lot of different spaces, from litigation to investigations, depending on your industry or your space, regulatory compliance requests. In the government, they have the Freedom of Information Act and public records requests, congressional inquiries, internal audits. All of those have to keep in mind, where is all this data and how do we get it in a format that we can hand it off to somebody? So as an employee of an organization, really, what do we need to think about today that's out there, and then what's coming up? Whether you work in legal or not, just being aware of these things can help you manage your data footprint a little better, but also treating data the way it needs to be treated from a liability perspective, from a risk perspective, and also for your own internal investigation perspective. You never want to get caught with, I've mistreated some of our corporate data in some fashion unintentionally, and now I have a liability associated with it. So where do we sit today? Well, generative AI is a big thing. Machine learning is a big thing. ChatGPT is all over the news. If you aside from the news stories that are hitting us today that are terribly sad, but over the last several months, you've heard a lot about ChatGPT. Almost every day there was an article or a news story about ChatGPT and what it can do, where it's failed. So that's not going away. It's going to continue to grow and continue to be utilized, and the language algorithms behind that are still going to be used in a lot of different ways. Matter of fact, predictive modeling that's also associated with that is already well adopted. You're looking at predictive models if you've ever shopped on Amazon. When you go to Amazon, and even if you just search for something, hey, I want to get a pair of white tennis shoes, the next time you log into Amazon, it says, hey, we've seen that you liked white tennis shoes. What about all these other white tennis shoes? Or have you thought about socks yet? So it's predicting what your traits, your likes, your patterns are automatically, very similar to what we're seeing in machine learning and predictive modeling in data. So the applications are already there. And there's a little funny story from November, or not November, was it November this year? It was earlier this year. I think it may have been in August, where in North Carolina, an attorney used ChatGPT to write a brief for him for the court. He wrote the brief with ChatGPT. He cited some cases that he needed to use for precedence in the ChatGPT from that particular brief. Even asked ChatGPT, are these legitimate cases? Were they really, truly, part of the court records? And it said, yes, they were. Well, they get into court. The judge looks over the brief. He'd already read through it. He comes up and sees it and goes, none of these cases exist. I looked them all up. These are all fake cases. So you can't rely on ChatGPT yet. And as a matter of fact, that you can imagine how embarrassing that is for an attorney to stand in front of a judge, if not potential malpractice for that. So there are some really good applications of things like predictive modeling and those the ChatGPT type language things, particularly when we were looking at automating repetitive processes. So if you're doing something at work that, not to replace you, but the tedious things that you have to do over and over again that are machine oriented or computer oriented, that's where some of these models can come in and help speed those things up and make them more accurate so there's less human error. But also can address if there's a failure or a problem or a hiccup along the way. So there are some really good applications of this type of artificial intelligence beyond your big machining and manufacturing. Now, tomorrow, where's this going to go? Kind of like that. The automation, you'll see a lot of that start to roll out. Applications are going to have more and more of the predictive modeling, the text that can help you. We use a CRM inside our company that handles both our contact management and our marketing and some other stuff, and it has an AI, a ChatGPT-like component where it can help you write an email before you write the email. So you can go in and tell it what you're trying to say, and it'll put out nice sentences for you. And then that's going to open up a whole lot of other worms for security, because there's new data types, and then also the who owns that text and that communication and that technology that's being built along the way. So things to think about in the workspace. Even churches are starting to see it because they're creating content and putting it out on the web, and it's being part of search engines, and it's also being manipulated, or deep fakes are being laid over it to target individuals like what we saw with the previous session. So one thing, this is our security for our company. Again, I'm not trying to sell Casepoint to anybody here, so forgive me for having a couple of logos, but these are just some of the security certifications that you can see just to protect this data. Data centers have things like what are called SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3. If you're an IT person, you know what those are. There's a lot of alphabet soup here. But when you're dealing with the federal government, they have their own strict restrictions, and we had to meet those. The states have theirs. The Department of Defense has theirs. ISO certifications that attest from third parties that you're handling data and business and your processes in a certain way. So if you're a smaller organization and you have the ability to go talk to your IT team, you might want to say, hey, have we looked at all of this? I'm not discounting your expertise, but just making sure, what have we done to try, to secure our data? Because it could be pulled in for something later. The next part of that is where we come in as a company, and there's a few companies in our space, but it's not just specifically to litigation or investigations. What we're looking at is a lot of different data sources out there that are going to need to be reviewed at some point. They're going to need to have eyes set on them to respond to a request, or to respond to litigation or an internal audit from a third party that manages your industry or the IRS or anything like that. So there are tools that go out and intentionally find all of these pieces of data where they may sit in places that you wouldn't expect beyond the normal Word documents and Excel files and PowerPoints and things like that. But how do we make sense of all this data and put it in a place where it can be used effectively in response to whatever that request was? So where we fit from a technology perspective, and try to introduce you a little bit to our space, is we're sitting in the middle to take all this disparate data, this unstructured and structured data, put it into a place where it can be easily reviewed, understood, analyzed, even some really cool technology with artificial intelligence and predictive modeling to help forecast against other data that may match the same kind of criteria we're looking for, so we can be effective and thorough and efficient in responding to whatever it is that we need to respond to. If you get, a lot of corporations get what are called third-party subpoenas. They're not part of the litigation per se, but they were an actor in some aspect of that litigation, and they're not going to be subject to being fined or part of the court case itself, but they need to get the data from that third party. Like a subcontractor often isn't necessarily subject to the litigation, but the contractor is, so they need to go subpoena that third party to get their data, to respond to the court to say, this is everything we know about that's inside this particular case. Or if we're looking at FOIA at the government level. So there's a lot of different pieces of the data that's out there that you want to consider, but you as an employee have a responsibility to some degree, or even an owner of a company, is to take account for all those data types. Where do you have data? What are you creating as data? Where are you storing it? Do you have, as a corporation, and most times large organizations will have like a data retention policy that you can't delete data before a certain time. We have to hang on to it for a period of time because we may need to respond to some type of external request. The other aspect of this is thinking about, have you ever sent yourself something from work to your personal device, to your home email address that was work related because you went, I'm not going to carry my laptop home. I'll just open it at the computer at house, or I'll pull it up on my phone. That makes it so that all of your data in that personal account can now be considered discoverable, and it can be pulled into a lawsuit. So if you've ever done that, or like I do, I've got my phone, I have my work and my personal email accounts on that phone. Well, I've unintentionally responded from my personal email account to a work account, or a work response, or an email at a couple of times. Well, that just opens up that email account now to where it could be potentially requested and collected as part of discovery for a case. Now, 99% of the data in there is going to be considered to be irrelevant and unrelated, but that means somebody can grab that data and somebody else gets to set eyes on that data. Now, I don't worry about anything that's on my phone. I have nothing to hide. But there are sensitive things that we may have from a personal perspective, like your own financial information or a hardship that you're going with your families. If you don't want that out there before other eyes that are foreign to you and your family and don't really care about it, probably don't want to be doing that. So be careful about it. It's just something to be diligent and intentional about as you go through your daily business. Plus, there is a liability. If you're actually taking data off of company systems and putting them onto mobile devices like a USB drive or a flash drive, you could be, disciplined for that one way or the other. It could be losing your employment. It could be that you're sued. It could be that you're held criminally liable for holding on to data or stealing trade secrets or business sensitive data. So just keep in mind, be above board and be smart. Whether your intentions were bad or not, if you've put it on something, it can look questionable. And I'll show that in the last slide as well, kind of a thought on that. Really what we're doing from a technology perspective is, like we mentioned, this is how we consider all that data. So there's all this data over here on the left-hand side of the screen that come from different sources. What we can do in our technology is pull all that data together to put it in that format for that review, where we're applying things like analytics and artificial intelligence and timeline management, chronologies, and all that sort of thing. So we really can help create some efficiencies in that review process. But the motivation for what I wanted to tell you is there's a purpose to all this, why we want to keep data straight and organized and really well accounted for. Because at some point it could go into a system like this and it's all going to get exposed and it's all going to get eaten up and reviewed and, just sliced and diced until they figure out what's in there. Certainly, if you're part of a lawsuit, there's nothing, you're going to have to submit your data at some point. Even corporately, you may become a custodian of record where they're going to collect the data that you've produced during your employment. Perfectly fine. You shouldn't have anything to hide. They're going to review it and they may ask you some questions about it at some point. But having it in order and knowing how to submit back that information is always a good thing as well. Just keep your house in order, so to speak. So from a practical perspective, how do we apply all this? There is some things that you need to consider on a personal level. I don't want to rehash what Kenneth said in the last session, but being smart about your data, putting the right protections in, the right passwords. Don't post things, don't take pictures of things that you don't want anybody else to see. The old adage of if your grandma can't see it, you probably shouldn't have it, or if Jesus can't look at it, or you'd be embarrassed if he was, probably not a good photo to have or to take or to look at. Or any kind of document like that. Even if you're doing things, your social media posts from a personal perspective can obviously impact your employment. We've seen people post things and get fired. There was recently in the last week a student that got expelled from university because of her stances with what's going on in Israel. So be cautious about what you're presenting out there and what you have on your devices. Also, from a business perspective, do the same. You don't want to have things that are disparaging about your boss in your chats, even if it's with your best work or your best friend at work or another department or anything that would compromise the ability of your organization to look at you and say anything but, oh, they're a perfect employee. They're never compromising us. They're not sharing our secrets that we have from a business perspective. Even more so if you work in a church environment, you'd never want to call out a member of your congregation in a disparaging way, even if it's on an internal pastor chat. You just don't do those things. But what you can do from a business perspective also is like what we talked about on personal, is stay current on technology. Understand the data that you're creating. Understand the applications you're using, where that data is stored. So if you need to go back and look at it, you don't have the lost file for one, but two, what your footprint's going to look like. Where you're creating stuff. Doesn't mean be reserved about it, just means be smart about it. Secure your data. We talked about passwords from a personal perspective. Likewise, at a business perspective, you may be the asset in your organization that can go in and say, look, we need to put a couple of things in place for security. Even if it's a small, personally owned business where you're mowing people's yards, but if you have a database of client information, this person lives at this address and they've paid me this much to mow their yard every week. Well, that's interesting information put into the hands of the wrong person. Or if you ever get an audit, you're going to need to be able to produce that information up pretty quickly. So keep that data secure, keep it organized. It doesn't have to be complex or fancy and spend a lot of money on it. There's a lot of free tools to do that. But from a business perspective, just make sure you follow the plans of your organization. And then the last part is plan for the future, which is kind of hard. It's like trying to hit a moving target. We don't know what technologies specifically coming down the pipeline. We do know that AI is going to be broadened. We know that there's going to be newer and better and shinier technology. The new iPhone was just released. So there's going to be new technology that's released every day. So just attempt to look forward to that. And then when you want to adopt something corporately, what's the ramification of that? What's it going to create? And where do we need to handle that? And how do we need to handle that? So there's a tremendous amount of really, really good experts. Hopefully in your organization, you've got good IT people or information security people. If not, there's organizations like Kenneth's, for example. I keep relying back because that was the last session, that can go in and advise you on that. But there's also a ton of forensic companies. There's free resources. There's programs at universities like Liberty that can even educate you on aspects of technology that you might want to apply both personally and in your business world or your corporate world for whatever practices and purposes you have with data. What I'll leave you on, just so we stay pretty close to on time, are the two scriptures that I think best fit this in a lot of ways. One is the Matthew 10 scripture. I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, but the better part of this is be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. So the wise aspect comes to very much tying into the cybersecurity aspects, but also just wise in your work. Don't do things that you think might be questionable. Don't do things that are just haphazard or reckless. Keep track of where your stuff is. The serpents are wise. They can navigate through everything and walk out unscathed. We need to do the same, but make sure that what you're creating and what you're maintaining and what you're doing in your business practices and your personal practices are above board. So you're as innocent as the dove, but you're as wise as the bad guys that are coming after you. And then lastly is don't fall victim to the negative aspects of what we're hearing with technology, but be cautious of it. So see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world and not according to Christ. So when we're looking at this technology that we see on a world frame, be mindful that it has a potential to be tremendously beneficial and effective and efficient and wonderful. Being able to use things like FaceTime to speak with relatives in other parts of the world is fantastic technology. But likewise, a photo posted of your 7-year-old that could be used in artificially intelligent produced pornography is something that's a risk. So we just want to be mindful of that. But also don't fall for the fact that these are all our saviors. They're technologies. We use them as tools. So that's, if there was anything that I would leave you on with tonight, is be safe, but be mindful for sure. So I'll pause because I think we've got a minute or so left before we wrap up the conference. Any questions that you guys had about technology in the business place, particularly when it comes to the legal area?
I had one. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on tools like Norton LifeLock and services like that.
I think from a personal perspective, I think they're good. From a corporate perspective, they usually are a little bit lacking, depending on the size of your organization. What you want to look for when you're looking at technologies for security, in particular, are those that have like enterprise level models. That's not just license to license to license, which are kind of segregated or siloed in what they work. You want one that's going to look for your whole organization. And I'm by no means a massive IT person. I know enough about information security where my chief information officer trusts me to have passwords for my laptop, and that's about as far as I get. But having worked on the network side before, is you want to, from a corporate perspective, you want enterprise level because it's looking at all of your users. Personally, I think they're great. If you can afford whatever service that they're providing, I would just go with what's out there that you can afford because they can get expensive. If you look at a $60, $70 a month subscription to have your family under one of these, which some of them are that much, that may not be in your budget. But there are some free ones that you lose a few functionalities, but in a lot of cases, something's better than nothing.
Sure. Well, this has been a great day. And
Just a comment
Sure.
from an enterprise perspective. A big concern is the actual attacks that come in. And I won't cite what we use,
Sure.
but I can tell you that is probably one of the chief concerns of large enterprises to have these these bot attacks on your environment. Huge issue.
Sure.
Companies spend a lot of money on this, and I am familiar with this because I have to deal with it on the other end when people complain about it. All right, but it is a big deal, and it's probably just as nasty as protecting your own data. I deal with PII and PHI data every day, multiple times a day. My personal phone is encrypted especially for me to be able to handle that. And the agreement is anything I put on that phone is accessible to the corporation.
Yep. Yeah, you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, for our organization, which we have about 80 employees in the U.S. and about 600 worldwide, or 800 worldwide, our number one annual budget line item is information technology and security. By far, it exceeds all of our salaries, our insurance, our marketing budgets combined. Because we know, obviously, I've mentioned we work with the SEC and a lot of other high-profile clients that we're a target. So, you got the data, we want to go get to it, so we have to be
once
above and
growth
beyond.
can put you out of business.
Yep.
Basically.
Yeah. So there's a lot of bad actors in the world that want to do bad things. So we're being wise as serpents as we can, but making sure we're being as innocent as doves as possible. So. Well, just the last thought. Thank you very much for having this, and thank you for having me. It's a great joy to be a part of a community.